Welcome back for section 20, which happens to be the last section in the overall air transportation module. We're going to pick up where we left off from the previous section, best practices for U.S. importers working with air freight forwarders. When developing an SRM approach to the importer-forwarder relationship, we're going to continue on by looking at how U.S. companies should investigate areas that include the following: membership in trade associations. And we're talking specific to the air freight industry. And there's more than one, and we're not talking about IATA. IATA has to be a given. There's more than one other trade association, but one of the big ones, which we at Mercado have no affiliation with whatsoever, is the International Federation of Freight Forwarders Associations. Now that name doesn't line up with the acronym FIATA, but that's a whole other conversation. But this is an organization that on its website states that as a trade association, it represents 40,000 forwarders around the world. That's a lot of forwarders. That's a lot of competition, and that can only benefit the U.S. importer. That's a subject for another day. But as far as membership and trade associations go, it's worth asking the question, and FIATA being one of the more recognizable trade associations in the global air freight space. More operationally, in our second sub-bullet point, we want to look for evidence of how the air freight forwarder manages its relationship with the carriers, not unlike what we went over in the ocean module. First off, use of standard operating procedures, processes, policies, procedures, flowcharts that depict from start to finish what the inbound flow of air freight into the United States looks like, specific to individual customers. SOPs are important across any mode of transportation. Any contractual agreements that air freight forwarders have with the airlines. Clearly, a forwarder isn't going to be in a position to show their contractual agreements, but proof of their existence is a reasonable thing to ask for. At the very least, last sub-bullet on this slide is a list of carrier partners. Who does the freight forwarder work with? What airlines do they have agreements with? And as a part of that, specific trade references from those airlines. Some other considerations: the percentage of contracts with all cargo carriers versus passenger airlines. Ideally, as a U.S. importer, and depending on the nature and volume of cargo that we bring in, it's not a bad idea to work with freight forwarders that have a pretty good balance between all cargo carrier contracts and contracts with passenger airlines. That just means that the air freight forwarder has access to a broader pool of flights, aircraft, and cargo capacity in different places around the world. We also want to look at things like spot quoting capabilities, but any serious air freight forwarder is going to have some form of agreement in place with all cargo carriers and passenger airlines. We'd like to know the mix between the two. What types of contracts with the airlines does a freight forwarder have? Are they based on weight tiers, that 45 to 100 kilo range, 100 to 500 kilo range, 1,000 and above kilo range? How these contracts are built between forwarders and airlines are going to trickle down to the way in which we as U.S. importers are presented with quotations and potential bids. Does the forwarder have pallet position agreements with an airline? That's a sign of large volumes of cargo. That's a good thing. Or block space agreements, BSAs, as we've talked about a bunch of times. On the technology side, what's the operational software that an air freight forwarder uses to cut airway bills, to determine volume versus actual weight, to run their air freight business? Track and trace has to be a given in this day and age, and connectivity with customer systems as well. Another one we might add is the use of e-airway bills via the IATA initiative that we mentioned so many sections ago. Like any mode of transport, technological capabilities plays a big role. We have to be asking some very pointed questions of these air freight forwarders. We mentioned e-airway bill at the tail end of the last slide. A good question to ask, and this is indicative of the seriousness of the relationship between an air freight forwarder and IATA, is that level of use of e-airway bill. That's an IATA initiative, the electronic transmission of airway bill information. We mentioned a little bit about the use of standard operating procedures. We're talking with customers now. Previously, it was SOPs between the forwarder and the airlines. Now, it has to extend to customers. procedures for the onboarding of new clients, and the key performance indicators for air freight. A couple of examples being the number of shipments that moved as booked, number of shipments that were partialized and to what extent, number of shipments that didn't move as booked, lost cargo, damaged cargo. The list goes on and on. What KPIs does the air freight forwarder use to measure its performance, the performance of the airlines, and ultimately the performance of overseas vendors and the U.S. importer? Industry-specific expertise is important as well. The characteristics of air freight and the requirements for air freight expertise can change depending on the nature of the industry being handled. Life science, as an example, has a lot of perishable medicines that are being shipped around the world. That requires a lot of industry-specific expertise. High tech, dealing with merchandise that is easily damaged, susceptible to humidity, high temperatures, things of that nature, and consumer electronics that are susceptible to theft. Industry-specific expertise is important in the air freight industry. Winding things down here, a couple of others. Continuing with the theme of susceptibility to theft, cargo security capabilities for theft, loss, or damage, anti-terror capabilities, goodness forbid, the terrorist activities take place in the air cargo industry. What capabilities, what measures do air freight forwarders take working in conjunction with airlines and trucking companies and line haul carriers, etc., to minimize the probability of terrorist activity perpetrating the air cargo industry? And lastly, on this slide, any involvement of the freight forwarder in mergers and acquisitions. Have they bought any companies recently? Are they too tied up in the integration of an acquisition to pay attention to their customers? Has the company been recently acquired themselves? They're not the acquirer, they're the acquiree, with employees in transition and leaving the company and such. These are important and fair questions to ask. Or is an air freight forwarder the rumored target of an acquisition? We should be thinking about that too. Well, that wraps up Module 8 on air transportation. As we do in all of our modules, we state our objectives at the beginning and we bring them back again at the end, and only you can decide if we achieved those objectives. What were they for Module 8? First, we wanted to present air transportation as a vital component of a U.S. import supply chain, either as a primary mode of transportation or as a complement to ocean freight programs. Second, we set out to offer a multifaceted portrayal of all the players and activities involved in a U.S. air import program. Identify the players, define what they do, go through operational processes. Hopefully we did a reasonably good job of that. Third, enhance the students' understanding of the operational, service, and documentation components of importing into the U.S. via air transportation. And then finally, share tactical and operational expertise that enhances an importer's knowledge of all aspects of inbound air transportation. That's just a fancy way of saying share some operational knowledge that makes the student more effective in the marketplace. Hopefully, we were able to achieve all 4 of our objectives. This will be the end of Module 8. When we come back in Module 9, we're going to tie together all of these transportation modes and study customs clearance into the United States through U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and sometimes its partner government agencies. See you then.